Hello and welcome to the in-news series of Drishti IAS. I am Pooja Dwivedi, and in this segment today, we are going to discuss about the 12th Ministerial Conference that is about to happen by the end of this month of the World Trade Organization. This topic is important from the perspective of prelims and also from the perspective of GS Mains paper 3rd. So let's begin with the different topics that we are going to look by. These are the topics that we are going to step gradually upon. And we will start with the news first. Now, as I have already mentioned that potentially we are going to have the 12th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization, which is the topmost decision-making body of the World Trade Organization. And this meeting it was supposed to happen last year itself in 2020 in Kazakhstan. But because of the novel coronavirus pandemic outbreak, it has shifted this year and it is going to be held in Geneva, Switzerland. So let's now begin. What is the history and what is World Trade Organization? What are the different issues and highlights that are going to dominate the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference number 12? So, as I can tell you that since the era of the silk trade to the era of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Trade Organization was actually formed at a later stage and it did not have its seeds up until 1995. Let me walk you through the history. Now, if we talk about the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, this was a byproduct of the Bretton Woods Conference. The Bretton Woods Conference, which was convened in order to structure out a post-World War II financially stable world. It gave birth to World Bank and also the International Monetary Fund. It also gave birth to International Trade Organization, which was supposed to serve as a third leg apart from World Bank and IMF. ITO was supposed to have served as a third leg to the entire financial structure. And accordingly, in 1948, the UN Conference on Trade and Employment did chalk out a charter in Havana that was known as the Havana Charter. Although Havana Charter did not come into being because US did not ratify it. And GATT, that is General Agreements on Trade and Tariff, signed by 23 countries in Geneva in 1947. It gave birth to rules and regulations that would be governing the trade and investment, generally the business around the globe. So as you can see, ITO, International Trade Organization, was ended as a stillborn because one of the leading trading, if we talk about the countries, US did not ratify it. Ratify means did not formulate any sort of legislation for giving execution to the International Trade Organization's Havana Charter. So GATT, since the year 1947, which came into execution in 1948, it was serving as a rule book for trade, investment, business, and everything related to goods, specifically goods, not services, specifically goods. It was there till the year 1995. And GATT did also have many rounds of negotiations. 8 rounds of negotiations were conducted under GATT, and it became the only multilateral instrument to have any support, to give any support for the international trade. And now the Uruguay round, which was conducted from the year 1987 to 1994, it culminated into the Marrakesh Agreement, and that established the World Trade Organization in the year 1995 itself. So the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trades of 1947, it was terminated in the year 1996, and GATT 1994 this has been governing with the help of the World Trade Organization. This has been governing the world trade. Okay, so remember this, it only deals with goods and not services. So as you can see, after the formation of the World Trade Organization, it has become the sole organization dealing with the trade and other sorts of trade developments in the world. Now, it has certain motives and goals. We will talk about them. Let's know about the membership. WTO has 164 members, and it also includes the European Union and 23 observer governments like from Iran, Iraq, Bhutan, and Libya. What does it do? It reduces or lowers the trade barriers. That means trade would be frequently happening between those countries which have lower trade barriers. That means lower quotas, lower duties, which would give rise to more demands of imports and reduced costs of production because of that happens. Because if I import any particular part for my equipment, if I import it and if it's cheap, only then I will be able to import it. And that would be helped by the World Trade Organization's rules for lower duties. And then only if I have an equipment at a cheaper price, I can integrate it with the final equipment, and then only I can sell it at a much lower price. Otherwise, I would have had to sell it at a higher price, right? So, it reduces the cost of production, reduces the prices of finished goods and services, and accordingly helps the citizens to have a greater choice. Then how does it do it? How does World Trade Organization work? First is negotiation. That means round table conferences and many other sorts of conferences occur in order to have proper talks and negotiations so that the rules are abided by all the member countries. Secondly is dispute resolution. If there is any sort of dispute that is arising between different countries, it should have a specificity of time is very important. Because of that, trade would be robust and frequent. Secondly, proper dispute settlement mechanisms should also be there. The WTO accordingly can simulate the economic growth and employment, and it can cut the cost of doing business internationally. And the WTO can encourage good governance, accordingly transparency, shared information and knowledge levels the playing field. Okay, let's move forward and talk about what is the relationship between the WTO and the United Nations. Okay, so first understand that WTO is not any sort of specialized UN agency. The relationship of WTO and the UN, it is governed by the arrangement for effective cooperation with other intergovernmental organizations, relations between the WTO and United Nations, which was signed on 15 November 1995. The Director General, can you name the Director General and her country of origin? Because her country of origin has been frequently asked in different state examination. So the Director General of WTO is a part of the Chief Executive Board of the UN. So through that only WTO is a part of the UN and has a greater interaction. The governance is such that the Ministerial Conference is the topmost decision-making body of the World Trade Organization, which meets once in 2 years. And whatever the decisions are taken, it is implemented by the General Council, which is institutionalized in Geneva. Okay, let's move forward and talk about the different WTO ministerial conferences. Different as in the main two, the first and the last. So ministerial conferences, they are a big opportunity for different member states to negotiate and formulate rules and pick up from the point where they dropped at the last ministerial conference. So first ministerial conference, it was held in Singapore in the year 1996. And the last one, it was held in Buenos Aires, and that was in 2017. The 12th one was supposed to happen in Kazakhstan, but now it is happening in 2021 in Geneva. So the conference, if we talk about of 2017, it ended with a number of ministerial decisions, including on fisheries subsidies and e-commerce duties, and a commitment to continue negotiations in all the areas. So fisheries subsidies are basically government actions or inactions towards any sort of institution that is extracting fishes in order to have more profits. Now, fisheries subsidies is going to be one of the major dominant parts for the ministerial conference, especially for countries like India, which has a huge coastline and many small and marginal fishermen's livelihoods depend on them. So, what is the governments of the member governments of the different nations are doing in order to have achievements towards having proper contracts and having proper mechanisms to formulate a policy which does not monopolizes one particular sort of extractor to have commercial fishing at an exorbitant rate, while other small fishermen, they suffer at the cost of that. So first is that. Second is e-commerce duties. What is going to be the proper amount of tax that the different monopolistic, specifically agencies such as Amazon, Facebook, what taxes are they paying in the country where they are making money? That is also going to be important, specifically more important after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, and when the online game has entirely changed because of the least interaction when it comes to human being. Markets by the online manufacturers are dominating our markets today basically. So these two are going to be the main thing. And also, if we talk about the highlights, I will try to put here that what are the highlights of the Ministerial Conference 12. First is revisiting the trade rules. The rules which have been governing the World Trade Organization member countries, they need a revisit. And because of that, economically weaker group of countries have to come into the picture, because it's important that the trade and development of the weaker section of the society when I talk about the entire world, the developing and least developed countries I'm talking about here, they should also benefit, because the trade market is upbeat right now. It is supposed to expand 11% in 2021 and by 5% by 2022. So as you can see, according to WTO itself, these estimates I am telling you here, and WTO is also saying that the trade would take place at a rate which is more than the pre-pandemic level. So this is the correct amount of time, this is the correct point of time where we can talk about the advantages for the economically weaker countries. And electronic commerce, investment facilitation, fishery subsidy, all this is going to be in the picture. Electronic commerce is something that we need to have more and more focus on, especially when the countries of G20, especially when the OECD countries are talking about having a minimum digital tax that should be executed on these agencies which have their head offices at a place where they are not supposed to pay as much tax as they should be paying in the countries where they are making money from. Secondly, investment facilitation. What is going to be the entire mechanism so that the stakeholders have their, first of all, investment secured. Secondly, the rights of investors to be secured. Now, this is something that will be a bone of contention between developed and developing countries. Fishery subsidies, as I already told you, what is going to be the mechanism to resolve the dispute when we talk about big commercial fishing extractors versus small and marginal fishermen, especially for countries which are hugely dependent on fishing, such as India. And technology for the production of vaccine, diagnostics, therapeutics, medical devices, this is going to be the most dominant because of the monopoly of certain pharmaceutical companies across the developed countries they are trying to monopolize the entire market by not transferring the technology to the developing and least developed countries and the know-how. Because of that, the share of vaccination, medical devices, and other things that are important to get rid of the COVID-19 pandemic is falling short of. And because of this itself, we are saying that we have seen actually that if developing countries did get the technologies and the know-how for developing vaccines, the least developed countries could have been at a better margin. And as you know, that only 4.1% of the least and lower developing economies have been vaccinated with at least one dose. So as you can see, the vaccines are not reaching fast enough. And even at a conference, the South African spokesperson did say, none of us are safe until and unless all of us are safe, because the COVID-19 virus will mutate. Okay, so this is going to be the issue. IPR related issues are also going to be there. IPR, I am here talking about with respect to development of technology for COVID-19 related diagnostics, vaccines, therapeutics. So these big companies, these big corporates which have their bases at developed countries, of course, will be dragged into the picture, and it will be not a good scenario for developed and developing countries, because developed countries also want to secure their interest and the corporates which have their base at the developing countries. And the TRIPS actually gave rise to the monopoly. Okay, so there is a basic clause by the name of TRIPS, which has given monopoly to certain IPR, intellectual property rights holding companies. So by invoking the clause of TRIPS itself, the developed countries corporates, the corporates which have their base in developed countries, they were able to not transfer, they were able to prohibit the transfer of the technology for vaccine development and know-how. So that also will be on the table when we talk about the negotiables. Okay, so let's move forward and talk about the importance of India and South Africa, how they have tabled a proposal in October 2020. So a proposal was tabled in October 2020 by India and South Africa to remove the provision of TRIPS, and proper technology transfer can happen between the developed and the developing countries so that more manufacture of vaccination can happen. This did not get the amount of support it should have, but a very little amount of support was given by America. This did, of course, arise a glimmer of hope for developed and least developing countries about the technology for vaccination. But let's see what happens. Now, here itself, India and South Africa said that diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, medical devices, and their methods and means of manufacture, they should also be taken into the account. And another issue that we are going to deal with at the Ministerial Conference is going to be fisheries. So current draft is really unbalanced in nature. It has its priorities set for the monopolistic fishery subsidies, for the monopolistic fishery extractors, and that is causing the fishes as resources to get depleted, and small and marginal farmers in the sense the fishermen, they are not getting the proper amount of livelihood because everything is getting extracted by big companies, and that's giving a threat, that's posing a challenge of threat to the livelihoods of small fishermen. Digital minimum tax, we have already discussed that by the G20 countries, it is being said that we should impose a worldwide taxation on the different e-commerce companies so that they should be paying the proper amount of taxation from the countries they are getting their revenue from. And that is also going to be a dispute because many developed countries have their bases, have the corporates serving as bases, and because of that, the proper amount of negotiations cannot happen at the World Trade Organization, although the same amount of countries have a huge role for the proper channelization of rules in WTO. Comprehensive Work Program, which actually talks about the development needs of developing countries. This is completely absent. That means no proper framework for e-commerce is there, and even if it has its roots for negotiation since the year 1998, we cannot have a proper negotiation here. So that is also going to be a highlight. Investment Facilitation Agreement. What should be the mechanism for investment facilitation in every country? That is going to be another point that the WTO is going to negotiate at. That means investors should have their rights respected in the country they are investing. Now, this could lead to a huge and a delayed amount of dispute because US and India are not seeing eye to eye when we talk about this. How to have a proper legislation and how to settle the dispute when an American or any foreign investor have their investments in India. Okay, and the Doha Agreement, despite several rounds of talk, have not been finalized yet, and that is going to be foreshadowing any sort of agreement as it is not yet settled. Okay, and also there is one-sided negotiation when we talk about joint statement initiative. One-sided negotiation through joint statement initiative is that a group of countries which have been dominating since many decades because of being economically more empowered, economically more significant, they will formulate a policy through joint statement initiative, and then it will be put on the table on a take it or leave it basis. So the smaller, least developing and the developing countries will have no choice either to take it or leave it. If they are not involved in the negotiation for formulating the policies, how can we expect fair trade among the countries? Let's move forward and talk about what India can expect. First, COVID-19 technologies. Although India has proved itself to be one of the worthy countries for production of COVID vaccines through Covishield and Covaxin, and now after the emergency use approval by different countries of both the vaccines, India could expect something positive because India is becoming a game changer. Fisheries for it is a challenge. As you can see over here, that fisheries still pose a challenge because the WTO chief herself has said that there can't be any guarantee for the fisheries subsidy. So the livelihoods of small and marginal farmers or fishermen, it lies into the hands of the government right now, but it is not actually very healthy. E-commerce as we know it, that India is leading the charts, and as you can see the online retail growth, and since the year 2013 to 17, where lies India? India has expanded its market share, of course, so India can have a lot to say when it comes to e-commerce companies. E-commerce, basically digital commerce. Okay, so what are going to be the certain challenges that WTO is going to look at? First of all, disagreements between developed and developing countries over priorities. What are going to be the priorities and modalities of negotiations? That means which topic is going to highlight the table and which is not. That is going to be a specific problem for developed and developing countries. The ones I highlighted will be the major points, especially the technologies and know-how transfer. Secondly, fishery subsidy and e-commerce. Again, plurilateral should dominate over the prevailing consensus principle. First is that because plurilateralism is absent in many of the major organizations. So, are the developed countries ready to take this concept ahead? That is going to be the second issue. Also, the failure to conclude the Doha round negotiation, as I have already told you, this is going to also overshadow the different amounts and different points of negotiation, because if the past is not cleared, what the present and the future holds is uncertain. The developing countries have failed to agree on common criteria for not only Doha Agreement, but also different other topics, especially IPR. What is going to be the status of IPR? The countries who have already developed their markets, the countries who are already so technological improved, why they should not help the COVID pandemic to end. It has a great deal of importance for the WTO. Also, public stockholding. When we talk about public stockholding, what is going to be the stockholding of different countries and what is going to be the insurance on food subsidy, what is going to be the insurance on food security, everything is going to be on the table, and that is a challenge. This challenge I have already talked to you about with. So if we talk about the right balance is needed in the negotiating text, no handful of countries should be dominating the entire table, especially after the and through the pandemic era, because the world has changed a lot since WTO was formed. We are talking about 1995 versus 2021. And it should consider members' varying levels of economic development and ensures that the flexibilities do not undermine environmental sustainability or the global commons as we know it, that fishery subsidies should not be proving as a challenge, because if extraction should go at such an extent that it starts posing threat to the environment, of course it should be looked at. Also, commitment to be flexible and engage continuously should be there, because if stagnation sets in any organization, rotting begins. Also, building confidence building measures are needed between the developing, least developed and the developed countries, so that they can have a very strong negotiation, a strong communication without any specific biases. Okay, that means having the previous knots to be untied and then beginning with the present. Okay, so as you can see, this is a question for you for answer writing practice. Discuss the importance of a revamped World Trade Organization in the pandemic era in 250 words. Okay, so you have to write it in 250 words, and that's it for today. Tomorrow we shall meet again with another segment. Until then, stay updated, and thank you so much for watching.